Welcome back to the Men We Are podcast. I'm Kieran. For those of you new to the show, this is something of a journey of discovery for me as I seek to improve my life, try to grow as a man, try to grow as a human being, and hopefully as I work through my problems, try and make sense of them, try to understand them, I inspire some of you to have a look at your lives too, so that we can all grow as a community of men. On the last episode, we talked about how closeness can feel quite dangerous, and how wounds from attachment and our emotional armour can keep people just far enough away to feel safe, but they're never close enough to feel loved. So today we're going to build on that again, as we always do on these episodes, and we're going to look at what happens next. Because if you don't feel safe asking for what you actually need, you don't magically stop needing it, do you? You might sometimes tell yourself that's the case and you don't need it, but it's simply not true. So instead, what happens secretly, you start hoping, and hope, when it isn't spoken out loud, it's going to quietly turn into something that psychologists call an unspoken contract. And I mean, the most simple definition is it's a deal you make in your head that nobody else ever actually agreed to, but the terms were very clear to you. So I'm currently going through a situation where I'm so hopeful of what's going to happen next in my life, because I genuinely don't know, and the decision's not really mine anymore to make, as I've kind of put my case forward of what I think is best, and it's up to someone else ultimately to decide. So I find myself kind of writing this contract with myself that is trying to satisfy all the connotations that could come next. And of course, I'm heavily leaning into the positive aspects because I'm quite an optimistic guy, quite glass half full. And I obviously, in my mind's eye, I see the situation that I desperately want playing out, but I also have to have some level of pragmatism so I don't entirely crush myself if it doesn't quite work out. Now, the difference with this contract is, although, yeah, I'm very, very aware of the terms, I've also certainly let the other person know that, like, this is what I think, this is where I think we should go. So the idea of these unspoken contracts comes from a psychologist named Denise Rousseau, and she studied what she called psychological contracts. So rather than unspoken, just psychological contracts. And if you have the time, it's really interesting reading. But the headline for this is these psychological contracts, they're unspoken expectations that people carry, either in the workplace or in relationships. And it's basically on the concept that if I do this, they'll do that. And, examples of that are like, if I show up, they'll notice. If I sacrifice, I'll be loved. If I'm patient, they'll choose me, But for as much sense as those things make in your internal monologue, you never actually say them out loud. So the other person never agrees. I mean, how can they? They didn't know. They didn't know what they were supposed to be agreeing to because you didn't say it. And yet, we still hold that other person accountable, which, when you say it plainly, is utter fucking nonsense. But emotionally, I'm sure we've all done it. And what happens then? The other person becomes confused because they had no idea what was expected of them. And your reaction doesn't align with the situation as far as they were aware. So a very simple example from my life, which of course, I'm sure a lot of you have done similar things, is I could be tidying up, say, the living room and then the children's playroom. And in my head, it's perfectly reasonable that as I'm doing that, my partner will be tidying the kitchen perhaps because it's a mess as well. So my inner monologue is chatting away to itself, saying things like, surely they can see I'm doing all this. Surely they'll step in and do something too. So after cleaning up, I come downstairs and it's still a real mess. And what do? I take the absolute hump and then drop a sarcastic comment like, oh, thanks for tidying up. And it's so toxic. Resentment has started to set in before a conversation even got going. It probably would have been better that when I started tidying up, I could have just said, how about I do this and you do this? You know, we establish a contract and it's not unspoken. At least then, if I come back and it's not been done, getting the hump is a bit more reasonable. But to have said nothing at all meant I was expecting a fair bit of mind reading. But if they're so stupid then, and common sense prevails and says they're stupid, why do we make these contracts? And the most dangerous of these unspoken contracts, they don't come from laziness. They actually come from a point of fear, and it's from attachment and the wearing of that emotional armor. Because instead of saying something, you know, like our basic emotional needs, like I need affection, or I need reassurance, or I need you to appreciate me, we tell ourselves, if I'm good enough, they'll give those things to me. And that is classic attachment behavior. Again, highly studied. The kind of king of this is John Bowlby, and then it was actually later expanded with like further research from his theory by Mary Ainsworth. The issue is, the reason we don't just blurt these things out is asking if it feels risky, we try to get those needs met without the risk. So what do? We perform. We maybe overfunction. We make ourselves as useful as possible, because being useful does actually feel safer than being vulnerable. Because if you're useful, you're definitely getting the task done. Whereas if you're vulnerable, you've kind of put yourself out there and you might not get the result you want. So obviously we're in this kind of slightly toxic situation, and, you know, resentment is going to build. And this is where things start to quietly go wrong. Because if your partner doesn't meet an expectation that they never knew existed, and I know this is stupid, but really think this through. Try and, if you have to pause and just take a second to think of a situation where you've been there, you feel hurt when they don't meet your expectation, even though they never knew the expectation was there. So from your side, that hurt, it's real. But from their side, they don't know why you're hurt, so they're just confused. So a relationship researcher, John Gottman, he talks about how couples start to then drift apart. And the drift isn't from explosions, but it's from something more subtle, which he described as missed emotional bids. And they're just basically small attempts for connection that go completely unnoticed. So what happens when the bid was never made out loud? How the hell can the message get delivered? Like, unless someone is very highly attuned and highly aware to your non-verbal cues, these things get missed out. So now we're in the danger zone, because as a result, you've tried, or you feel like you've tried, and you feel unseen, unappreciated, and ultimately a bit taken for granted. And at the other end, they feel totally blindsided, criticized, because you're obviously getting the hump with them, which is a negative thing, and they feel like they can't win. So what happens with that distance, that drifting apart? It grows, and it's not from a position of cruelty, it's just from a total lack of clarity. So I have racked my brain with this one, and yeah, I haven't had any recent ones from my life, but a good anecdote I've seen for this one, to try and give you context. There's a really nice video. It's fairly short, and I'm sure some of you have actually seen this on video sharing platforms. And it's a guy in America, I think, America or Canada. I'm sorry, I confuse the accent sometimes. And he sat outside in his back garden, just sat on a step, and he looks quite reflective. He's holding a small piece of metal which had previously been the centerpiece of a spool of electrical wire. And who I assume is his partner, she comes out, she asks what he's doing there. And he's staring at this piece of metal, turning it over and over in his hand. And he starts muttering about he had bought the spool like 20 years earlier, and he kind of felt like it coming to an end, like running out of electrical wire, was like symbolic of 20 years of his life having passed. And unfortunately, his partner at that stage then made a sarcastic comment. It's like about what hat he's wearing or something stupid, almost as if she was completely emotionally blind to the situation, because the guy was really, he was doing something that he didn't strike me from the video as someone that often opened up, and he was really trying there, totally making himself vulnerable, showing that he cared about whatever this is. He just didn't quite get to the verbalizing so that she understood what he meant. But the guy was really on the cusp of some fairly deep thought. And then he just gets the huff. He gets irritated and he storms off after her sarcastic comment. And somehow she's left confused. But it's a bit of a difficult example, because he maybe could have explained, he could have pumped the brakes when he realized she wasn't getting it. And he could have explained why he was being so reflective. You know, perhaps it was he was feeling his age just in that single lump of metal. But equally, I think she had the awareness of a fence post. But it's still a nice example of the way the guy was feeling. He was just so close to opening up. But because he didn't say, he didn't communicate, the point never got fully across. So why this sort of thing hits men hard with these unspoken contracts is, like, a lot of us were raised by some sort of silent rule book that we shouldn't be needy, we don't complain, and we should just be able to stoically handle things. So another psychologist, Ronald Levant, he calls this normative male alexithymia. It's a very difficult word for me to get my tongue around. Effectively, this is men being socialized to struggle with identifying and expressing emotions. So we're just not very good at it. And again, it pains me, but women are so much more attuned and so much better at this. So instead of saying what we actually need, we build the little contracts. If I keep providing, they'll see me. Or if I stay strong, they'll love me for it. If I don't cause any problems, I won't be a burden. But underneath all of that reliability that you're offering in your services and what you provide, your needs still exist. So ultimately, if your needs exist but they're not being fulfilled, and also the effort isn't acknowledged, especially when sacrifice gets misread as, like in my case, like when I go away, you're lucky to be away. That can be quite brutal, and I'll explain that in a second. But that's when men start to really feel like used or totally misunderstood, and not really that we're unloved, but more that we're unknown. So I said I'd explain it. In my case, I do a huge amount of traveling, nights out of bed, early mornings, late finishes, messes with my body clock, in order to provide a home and a life for my family, my children. But with young children that are obviously going to be a handful, sometimes me being away from home can actually be spun quite negatively, that being away is actually me getting time off, I'm getting a break, and I get to have some of my independence. And the danger is that if the fact I can be away from home feeling lonely and feeling that I'm really missing out on important aspects of my life, coupled with the effort that I'm putting in to keep the train on the tracks, if that gets ignored, or perhaps even weaponized against me, all that happens is resentment, withdrawal, and an emotional shutdown. So if you end up with unspoken emotional needs that aren't disappearing, you're going to get stuck with that resentment, withdrawal, and emotional shutdown. And, like, all that's going to happen off the back of that is you end up in this funny situation of both people end up being alone together. They're a couple, but they're two individuals. And I don't mean funny ha-ha, I mean funny odd. It's a really strange situation. And the tragedy is that most of this could be softened by just one thing, and that's clear and simple communication. Just opening up, being brave enough to verbalize the things that you need and not just expecting that they're obvious. A really great example of this from my day-to-day is I work in aviation and we want it to be as safe as possible. So we have this thing called threat and error management, where we're trying to find the things that could cause us any sort of reduction in safety. And it's how we manage those threats and mitigate them. And a chunk of it can be on the basis that, humans make mistakes, and that's fine too. Just we have to be wary of that. So if on a day, I'm feeling a bit tired. Let's say we've just crossed the Atlantic Ocean. We're kind of over Ireland. We're about an hour out from arrival, and I'm still feeling a bit tired. I will say to the other person that I am tired, because what I'm saying is, I'm not running at 100%, and I'm not going to be running at my optimum. So that makes the other pilot aware, and I'm not being weak by doing that. I'm just being responsible. And it's the exact same in relationships. You don't need to feel weak for saying things like, I'm a bit off today, or, my head's a bit noisy and I'm a bit low on energy. You're giving context to the other person. You're not giving excuses. You're telling them what's really going on. And it's kind of the same as checking in. Like some of you do this, which is great. It comes off the question when you meet your mates, or you start a conversation with other guys. What are you checking in with? And it is becoming a really popular start to a conversation amongst men, as it totally removes the ambiguity as to what the mood is, and it just gives you this open opportunity to say, yeah, fuck, I'm feeling a bit shit right now, and your brothers can they can acknowledge that and hopefully help you out. You don't need to immediately explain the why, because you might not even know yourself at that stage. But at least that way, if you need a minute to yourself, if you're a bit clippy with your responses, anything at all, it makes sense, and you're not going to end up confusing those around you. So I'm really increasingly doing that. What are you checking in with? Hey, I'm checking in with, a bit of anticipation about today, because I'm talking about some really tough issues, and, it's really making me reflect on my life. You don't have to be ashamed to do that. And the other guy will appreciate it, because they don't have to do any guessing, and they don't have to sit there going, what is going on? Why is today so awkward? So off the back of that, at its core, real intimacy, it doesn't come from being guessed correctly, from the other person managing to guess, I know them so well because I can just guess what's going on. It comes from risking honesty, from as we said, making yourself vulnerable and saying, this is what I need, or this is what hurts, or this is what I'm afraid of. Any of those things that, classically would make you feel weak. And that's how unspoken contracts turn into conversations, and conversations allow us to make real agreements. And if we can make real agreements, meaningful ones, that's where connection lives, and that's how the relationship is going to become better. So sadly, a lot of men actually don't know what they need, perhaps because of allowing themselves to be emotionally shut off for too long. But a closer reality is that most men, they know their role, they know what their duty is, and they know their function. But the problem with that is when your value is tied to what you do, you start believing love is actually something you earn. And that is nicely going to lead us on to the next episode's conversation, which is the difference between being needed and being known. Because someone can need what you provide without ever actually seeing who you are. And that's why so many men feel useful, but they don't feel loved. And that's where we're going to leave it today. So hopefully, if any of this stuff has hit, if you need to repeat the video or if you need to repeat the episode, there's some fairly deep stuff in there. Certainly, if you can reflect on your own life and try and give it a bit of context, it might actually help you. Ultimately, I think the big takeaway from today is like communication is key. Don't keep things to yourself. If you need to tell your mates that you're having problems, certainly you need to tell your partner. You need to share it. And it goes back to that line that I said earlier, that like if we can turn those unspoken contracts, the things that the agreements we want to make, turn them into a conversation, get the agreement, create a real agreement, we're going to get some really great connection, and we're going to feel so much better for it. We're going to grow, and we're going to feel fantastic, not just as men, but as human beings. So if you're enjoying this journey, if you think others will, please recommend it. Like, rate, subscribe, download, anything. Let's get this content in front of people. Let's help the brothers out, and hopefully you're enjoying it as much as I am. So until the next episode, I wish you the best of luck.